What are the biggest misconceptions people have about estate planning? Because this is something I see constantly. People don't usually come in with no understanding. They come in with partial understanding. They've heard things. They picked up ideas from friends, family, or the internet. And those ideas feel right. They feel logical, but in a lot of cases, they're just incomplete, or they're just not how things actually work in real life. So what I want to do in this video is walk through some of the most common misconceptions I see, but not as a list. I want to show you how these misunderstandings actually play out when something happens, because that's where the difference becomes clear. One of the most common assumptions is this: my spouse can handle everything. And what people usually mean by that is if something happens to me, my spouse will just step in and take care of things. But that's not always how it works. In Alabama, being a spouse doesn't automatically give you authority to act on behalf of your spouse while they're alive if they're incapacitated. Without a valid power of attorney, you may need to go through a conservatorship or guardianship process to gain that authority. And after death, even if everything is going to your spouse, there may still be a process to follow depending on how assets are titled. I've seen situations where a spouse assumed they could step in immediately and handle everything, and then when they couldn't, it created a moment of panic. Not because anything unusual was happening, but because the expectation didn't match reality. Another very common misconception is that having a will avoids probate. It does. A will is actually the document that gets used in the probate process. It tells the court what you want to happen, but it doesn't avoid the process itself. In Alabama, if assets are in your individual name and don't have some way of passing without having to go through probate, then they're going to need to go through the probate process. I've had clients come in and say, we already have a will, so we're good. And what they meant was they thought they had avoided the process entirely. And so when we walked through it, they realized the will was just one part of the overall picture. Everything will just be split evenly. This is another assumption that sounds simple, but often isn't accurate. People think everything will just be divided evenly among my children, but that depends on how assets are structured. If accounts have beneficiary designations, those control. If property is jointly owned, then that may control. If assets are in different forms, they may not flow through the same process. I've seen estates where the intention was clear. Everything should be divided evenly, but because of how those assets were set up, that's not what actually happened, and that created confusion for the family. Another misconception is that estate planning is only for people with a certain level of wealth or a certain level of net worth or assets. People will say, I don't have enough to worry about that. But estate planning is not just about the size of your estate or your net worth or the things that you own. It's about decision making. It's about who's in charge. It's about how things are handled. I'm too young to need this. This one comes up a lot. People think estate planning is something you do later in life. But the need for planning isn't tied to age. It's tied to whether you have people, responsibilities, or assets that would require decisions if something happened. I worked with younger clients who initially felt like this wasn't something they needed to think about yet. And then once we walk through what happens without a plan, their perspective changed altogether. Once I do this, I'm done. This is a big one. People think estate planning is a one-time event, a one and done, set it and forget it. You create the plan, you sign the documents, and you're done. But as I've talked about in other videos, plans need to be updated over time because life changes. My family will figure it out. This is one of the most common assumptions. My family will just figure it out. And in many cases, families do figure things out, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And it doesn't mean it's the outcome that you would have chosen, and certainly not always the outcome your family would have chosen. I've seen families where everyone was doing their best to figure things out, but without clear guidance, it was a much more difficult process than it needed to be. Adding someone to an account solves the problem. This is a very common shortcut people take. They add a child to a financial account. They add someone to a property, and they think that solves the problem, but that approach can create unintended consequences. It can affect ownership, it can affect control, and it can affect how assets are distributed. The internet has all the answers. We live in a time where information is easy to access, and that's helpful. But estate planning is not just about information. It's about applying that information to your specific situation. What's important to understand is that these misconceptions don't usually cause problems right away. They sit in the background, they feel correct, and then when something happens, that's when the gap shows up. I've seen situations where someone felt very confident about their plan, and then when we walked through it, we uncovered several assumptions that didn't match how things would actually work. That's a hard realization, but it's a really valuable one. This matters because clarity changes everything. When you understand how things actually work, you can make better decisions. You can build a plan that fits your goal, and you can avoid surprises later. Instead of relying on assumptions, it's better to ask questions. How do my assets actually transfer? Who has authority in different situations? What process will my family go through? Those questions lead to better planning. So the key takeaway is this. Most people don't get estate planning wrong because they don't care. They get it wrong because they're working from incomplete or inaccurate assumptions. And once those assumptions are corrected, everything becomes clear. At the end of the day, estate planning isn't about knowing everything. It's about understanding how all of the pieces fit together. Because when you have that understanding, you can make decisions with confidence. And that's what leads to a plan that actually works.